J.D. Vance had calculated every word that night on CNN to humiliate Jasmine Crockett. With his devastating line, "You came here for ideology, I came here for facts," he would silence her, make her look inexperienced, and remind the national audience who the real political heavyweight was. But there was one thing he hadn't calculated: the documents Jasmine had been keeping for 3 years from Vance's Ohio Senate tenure, documenting the dirty deals that had made his career possible. What started as a routine political debate exploded into the most shocking live television confrontation in modern political history. When Jasmine finally responded to his condescension, her words didn't just destroy his arguments. They exposed a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of Ohio politics. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. CNN's Washington bureau crackled with the kind of energy that only comes with high-stakes live television. It was October 12th, and Anderson Cooper 360 was hosting what had been billed as a frank discussion about the future of American politics between rising stars from both parties. The network had promoted it heavily, two of the most talked-about figures in their respective parties, facing off in prime time with no scripts, no handlers, just raw political combat. J.D. Vance sat in the guest chair closest to Anderson Cooper, looking every inch the polished political operator he had become. At 39, he possessed the kind of media-savvy confidence that had made him a conservative darling and a frequent guest on cable news shows. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his tie was knotted with precision, and his hair was styled in the kind of deliberately casual way that suggested hours of preparation made to look effortless. But it was his demeanor that really told the story. Vance carried himself with the quiet arrogance of someone who had never lost a televised debate, who had built his political career on his ability to articulate conservative talking points with intelligence and passion. He had written a best-selling book, served in the Senate, and was widely considered a potential presidential candidate. Tonight, he was confident, would be another victory in his long string of media successes. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, and the contrast couldn't have been more stark. While Vance projected the kind of polished confidence that came from years of media training and political calculation, Jasmine radiated a different kind of energy, quieter, more focused, more dangerous. She wore a simple black blazer over a white blouse, minimal jewelry except for the same gold cross she always wore, and carried herself with the calm assurance of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to reveal. At her feet sat a leather briefcase that looked modest and unremarkable, giving no hint of the explosive documents it contained. For 3 years, ever since Vance had announced his Senate campaign, Jasmine had been quietly building a file on his political rise. She had reached out to former staffers who had worked on his campaigns, spoken with Ohio political operatives who had witnessed his backroom dealings, and most importantly, made contact with whistleblowers who had tried for years to expose the corrupt bargains that had made Vance's career possible. What she had discovered was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond the usual political horse trading and compromise that characterized most political careers. The documents in Jasmine's briefcase told a story of systematic corruption, of explicit quid pro quo arrangements, and of a politician who had quite literally sold his principles to the highest bidder. But Jasmine had been patient. She knew that in politics, timing was everything. She had watched Vance's star rise, had seen him position himself as a populist champion of working-class Americans, had listened to his speeches about draining the swamp and fighting corruption in Washington. Tonight, she was finally ready to show the American people who J.D. Vance really was. Anderson Cooper opened the segment with his characteristic blend of gravitas and casual authority. Tonight, we're joined by two of the most compelling voices in American politics: Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, author of Hillbilly Elegy and a leading voice in the Republican Party, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas, a rising star in the Democratic Party and a powerful advocate for social justice. He turned first to Vance as protocol demanded. "Senator Vance, let's start with you. The Republican Party is at a crossroads. How do you see the party evolving, and what role do you hope to play in that evolution?" It was exactly the kind of softball question that Vance excelled at handling. He leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming serious and thoughtful. "Anderson, I think the Republican Party is returning to its roots as the party of working Americans," he began, his voice carrying the slight Appalachian accent that had become part of his political brand. For too long, both parties have been captured by elite interests that care more about their own power and profit than about the struggles of ordinary families. It was a perfectly crafted answer, hitting all of Vance's favorite themes: populism, anti-establishment sentiment, empathy for working-class concerns. He had given versions of this answer hundreds of times before, and it rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. "I didn't come to Washington to play political games or to enrich myself," Vance continued, his voice taking on a note of moral authority. "I came here to fight for the people who sent me here, to be their voice in a system that has ignored them for too long." Cooper nodded and turned to Jasmine. "Congresswoman Crockett, your response?" Jasmine didn't immediately launch into the kind of partisan counterattack that viewers might have expected. Instead, she sat back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Well, Anderson," she said, her voice calm and measured, "I think Senator Vance makes some interesting points about fighting for working families. I'm curious to know more about his specific record on those issues during his time in Ohio politics." It was a subtle opening gambit, not an attack but a gentle probe that suggested deeper knowledge of Vance's background than he might have expected. Cooper, sensing potential conflict, decided to follow up. "Senator Vance, before your time in the Senate, you were involved in Ohio state politics and business. Can you talk about that experience and how it shaped your political philosophy?" Vance's smile flickered for just a moment, so briefly that most viewers probably didn't notice it. But Jasmine caught it, and she knew that her opening probe had hit its mark. "Absolutely, Anderson," Vance said, recovering his composure quickly. "My work in Ohio taught me firsthand about the challenges facing American businesses and workers. I saw how government regulations and policies can either help or hurt working families, and that experience taught me the importance of practical, results-oriented governance." It was another smooth answer, but this time there was something slightly defensive in his tone, a subtle acknowledgement that this line of questioning might be more dangerous than the usual cable news softballs. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more focused. "That's interesting, Senator," she said. "I'd love to hear more about those practical, results-oriented approaches. Specifically, I'm curious about your work with Ohio Energy Partners during your time as a private consultant. That seems like it would be a great example of the kind of public-private cooperation you're talking about." The temperature in the studio dropped several degrees. "Ohio Energy Partners wasn't a, 'That's interesting, Senator,'" she said. "I'd love to hear more about those practical, results-oriented approaches. Specifically, I'm curious about your work with Ohio Energy Partners during your time as a private consultant. That seems like it would be a great example of the kind of public-private cooperation you're talking about." Name that came up often in discussions of Vance's background, and for good reason. It was a consulting arrangement that had been kept deliberately quiet, buried in financial disclosure forms and corporate filings that few reporters had bothered to examine. But Jasmine had examined them, very carefully. J.D. Vance's media training had prepared him for hostile questions, aggressive follow-ups, and attempts to corner him on policy positions. But nothing had prepared him for this: a soft-spoken congresswoman who seemed to know details about his background that he thought had been safely buried. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Congresswoman," Vance said, his voice still controlled but now carrying a slight edge. "I've been transparent about my business activities in Ohio, and all of my financial relationships have been properly disclosed according to federal ethics requirements." It was a classic political deflection, technically accurate but designed to avoid engaging with the substance of the question. Under normal circumstances, it might have worked. Most cable news interviews moved too quickly for detailed follow-ups, and most interviewers didn't have the specific knowledge necessary to push back on vague answers. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Jasmine wasn't most interviewers. "Oh, I'm sure they have been, Senator," she said, her tone remaining friendly, but now carrying an undertone that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. "I was just curious about the specifics of that relationship, given how it might relate to your current positions on energy policy and regulatory reform." She paused for a moment, letting the tension build. For instance, the consulting contract you signed with Ohio Energy Partners in 2018 included some very interesting provisions about regulatory advocacy and political consulting. I thought that might be relevant to our discussion about fighting for working families. Vance's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Ohio Energy Partners contract was one of the documents he had hoped would never see the light of day, not because it was technically illegal, but because it revealed the stark contradiction between his public populist image and his private work for corporate interests. Congresswoman, I think you might be conflating different aspects of my work in Ohio, he said, his voice becoming slightly sharper. My consulting work was focused on economic development and job creation, which is exactly the kind of practical problem-solving I brought to the Senate. It was a reasonable-sounding answer, but Jasmine noticed that he hadn't actually denied the existence of the contract or disputed any of the details she had mentioned. He was hoping to deflect and move on, but she wasn't going to let him. I appreciate that clarification, Senator, she said. But I think the specifics matter here, especially when we're talking about your record of fighting for working families versus corporate interests. She reached down toward her briefcase, a gesture so casual it almost seemed accidental. But the movement sent a clear message. She had documentation, and she was prepared to use it. Perhaps we could discuss some of the specific recommendations you made to Ohio Energy Partners regarding state environmental regulations. I think that would help our viewers understand how your approach to consulting work aligns with your current political positions. The studio fell silent except for the hum of television equipment. Cooper, sensing that something significant was happening, leaned forward slightly, his journalistic instincts telling him that this was about to become much more than a routine political discussion. Vance looked at Jasmine across the small table that separated them, and for the first time since the interview began, he seemed to understand that he was facing someone who had come prepared for war. J.D. Vance had built his political career on his ability to control narratives and dominate conversations. He was quick-witted, well-prepared, and had never met a political opponent he couldn't outmaneuver in a televised debate. But sitting across from Jasmine Crockett, watching her calmly reference documents that he thought were buried in obscure corporate filings, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine concern. He decided to go on the offensive. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, his voice taking on a condescending tone that he had perfected over years of cable news appearances. I appreciate your interest in the details of my background, but I think this kind of gotcha politics is exactly what's wrong with Washington today. He leaned back in his chair, projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel. The American people don't care about arcane consulting contracts or corporate filings. They care about results. They care about politicians who can actually get things done, not activists who are more interested in scoring political points than solving problems. It was a calculated insult, designed to diminish Jasmine by portraying her as an inexperienced ideologue more interested in political theater than substantive governance. The word activist was particularly pointed, a dog whistle that suggested she was an outsider who didn't understand how real politics worked. But Jasmine didn't take the bait. Instead, she smiled slightly, an expression that somehow managed to be both warm and deeply threatening. I'm glad you mentioned results, Senator, she said, her voice remaining calm despite the obvious insult. Because I think the results of your consulting work are exactly what we should be discussing. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, placing it on the table in front of her with deliberate precision. You see, the American people do care about corporate filings and consulting contracts when those documents reveal that their elected officials have been saying one thing in public while doing something completely different in private. Cooper's eyes moved between the two guests, recognizing that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Most political interviews were carefully choreographed affairs where both sides stuck to prepared talking points. But this was different. This was a genuine confrontation between two people who clearly knew more about each other than they were letting on. What exactly are you suggesting, Congresswoman? Vance asked, his voice now carrying a harder edge. Jasmine opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a multi-page contract bearing the letterhead of Ohio Energy Partners and J.D. Vance's signature at the bottom. "I'm not suggesting anything, Senator," she said. "I'm simply pointing out that the consulting contract you signed with Ohio Energy Partners included explicit provisions for what the company called regulatory influence and political relationship management." She held up the contract so that the cameras could capture it, though the text was too small for viewers to read the details. "According to this document, you were paid $2.3 million over 18 months to help the company navigate state environmental regulations and to use your political relationships to advocate for policies that would benefit their bottom line." The number hit the studio like a physical force. $2.3 million was serious money, far more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime, and it painted a picture of Vance as someone who had profited handsomely from his political connections. "That's not," Vance began, but Jasmine wasn't finished. "The interesting part," she continued, her voice still measured and calm, "is that during the same period you were being paid by Ohio Energy Partners, you were also giving speeches across Ohio about the need to fight corporate influence in politics and to stand up for working families against powerful special interests." She pulled out another document, this one a printed schedule of Vance's speaking engagements during 2018 and 2019. "On March 15, 2019, you gave a speech in Youngstown where you said, and I quote, 'We need leaders who will stand up to corporate greed and fight for the little guy, not politicians who are bought and paid for by special interests.'" She looked up at Vance, who was now staring at the documents with barely concealed panic. "That speech was given exactly 2 weeks after you received a $400,000 payment from Ohio Energy Partners for what their internal documents describe as successful regulatory advocacy." The studio had become a pressure cooker, and J.D. Vance could feel everything he had built over the past decade beginning to crack. The documents Jasmine was displaying weren't just embarrassing, they were politically lethal, showing a pattern of behavior that completely contradicted the populist image he had spent years cultivating. But he wasn't going down without a fight. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice now openly hostile, "what you're doing here is exactly what's wrong with politics today. You're taking legitimate business relationships and trying to twist them into some kind of scandal." He pointed across the table at her, his finger jabbing the air for emphasis. "You came here for ideology, I came here for facts. The fact is that my work in Ohio created jobs, supported economic development, and helped working families across the state. If you want to play these kinds of games, maybe you should focus on your own record, instead of making up conspiracy theories about mine." It was meant to be his knockout punch, a combination of righteous indignation and personal attack that would put Jasmine on the defensive and allow him to regain control of the narrative. Instead, it was the moment Jasmine had been waiting for. "You're absolutely right, Senator," she said, her voice becoming quieter but somehow more dangerous. "Let's talk about facts." She reached into her folder and pulled out an audio recording device, placing it on the table between them. "This is a recording of a phone conversation you had on April 8, 2019, with Marcus Rodriguez, who was then the Director of Environmental Compliance for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources." Vance's face went pale. He had no idea how Jasmine could have obtained such a recording, but the specificity of her information suggested that she wasn't bluffing. "In this conversation," Jasmine continued, "you explicitly discussed using your political influence to help Ohio Energy Partners avoid compliance with new environmental regulations that would have cost them an estimated $50 million in cleanup costs." She looked directly at Vance, who was now staring at the recording device as if it were a live grenade. "Would you like me to play the recording, Senator? Or would you prefer to tell our viewers yourself about how you used your relationships with state regulators to help a corporate client avoid environmental responsibilities?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment of television history. Vance opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time in his political career, he was completely speechless. Cooper, realizing that he needed to maintain some semblance of journalistic control, leaned forward. "Senator Vance, do you want to respond to these allegations?" But before Vance could answer, Jasmine pressed play on the recording device. Vance's voice filled the studio, clear and unmistakable. "Marcus, I need you to understand the situation we're dealing with here. Ohio Energy Partners has been a major supporter of economic development across the state. They've created jobs, supported local communities, invested in infrastructure. Rodriguez's voice responded. I understand that, JD, but the environmental compliance requirements are pretty clear. The law doesn't really give us discretion on this. Vance's voice came back, and this time there was no mistaking the political calculation in his tone. Look, I'm not asking you to break any laws, I'm just asking you to be creative about how you interpret the requirements. Maybe there's a way to phase in compliance over a longer period. Or maybe there are alternative approaches that would achieve the same environmental goals without imposing such a heavy financial burden. The recording continued for another 30 seconds, with Vance explicitly discussing ways to help Ohio Energy Partners avoid the full impact of environmental regulations, using language that made it clear he was leveraging his political relationships for the benefit of a paying client. When the recording ended, the studio fell into stunned silence. J.D. Vance had faced difficult moments in his political career before: hostile interviews, political attacks, even occasional scandals that had required careful damage control. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, sitting in a CNN studio while audio evidence of his corruption played for a national television audience. His media training had taught him to always maintain composure, to never let opponents see weakness, to always have a prepared response for any attack. But those lessons felt useless now, as he stared at the recording device that had just destroyed his carefully constructed political persona. That recording, he began, his voice hoarse and uncertain, was made by Mr. Rodriguez himself. Jasmine interrupted, her tone still calm but now carrying the authority of someone who held all the cards. He was concerned about the political pressure he was receiving to ignore environmental violations, so he began documenting his conversations with political figures who were trying to influence regulatory decisions. She pulled another document from her folder. Mr. Rodriguez filed a formal complaint with the Ohio State Ethics Commission in August 2019, detailing multiple instances where you used your political influence to benefit your consulting clients. The complaint was buried by political appointees, but Mr. Rodriguez kept copies of all the documentation. Vance tried to respond, but Jasmine wasn't finished. The really interesting part, she continued, is what happened to Mr. Rodriguez after he filed that complaint. He was transferred to a lower-level position within the department, had his security clearance revoked, and was ultimately forced to resign from state government. She looked directly at Vance, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. And during the same period that Mr. Rodriguez was being pushed out of his job for trying to enforce environmental regulations, Ohio Energy Partners paid you a $600,000 bonus for what their internal emails describe as successful resolution of regulatory challenges. Cooper, who had been largely silent during this exchange, finally found his voice. Senator Vance, these are very serious allegations. The recording seems to show you explicitly discussing ways to help a client avoid environmental compliance. How do you respond to that? Vance looked around the studio as if searching for an escape route. His usual confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate look of a man, watching his career collapse in real time. The conversation was taken out of context, he stammered. I was simply trying to help a legitimate business navigate complex regulatory requirements. That's what consultants do. We help our clients understand the system and work within it. It was a pathetic response, and everyone in the studio knew it. The recording had been clear and unambiguous. Vance had been discussing ways to help his client avoid regulatory compliance, not navigate it legitimately. Jasmine let his weak explanation hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. Senator, this wasn't an isolated incident. I have documentation of at least 6 other instances where you used your political relationships to benefit your consulting clients at the expense of environmental protection and public safety. She held up a thick stack of documents. Phone records, email correspondence, internal company memos, financial transactions, all documenting a pattern of behavior that shows you were essentially selling access to your political network to the highest bidder. The devastation was complete. In the span of 15 minutes, Jasmine had systematically destroyed not just Vance's arguments, but his entire political brand. The populist champion of working families had been exposed as a corrupt consultant who sold his influence to corporate clients. The rest of the CNN interview was essentially a formality. J.D. Vance tried to mount a defense, claiming that his consulting work had been legitimate and that Jasmine was engaging in a partisan witch hunt. But his protests sounded hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence she had presented. Cooper, recognizing that he had just presided over one of the most explosive political interviews in television history, attempted to give Vance opportunities to explain or contextualize the damaging information. But nothing Vance said could overcome the impact of hearing his own voice, discussing how to help corporate clients avoid environmental regulations. By the time the interview ended, clips were already spreading across social media at viral speed. The audio recording of Vance discussing regulatory manipulation became the most shared political content of the year, garnering millions of views and shares within hours of the broadcast. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Conservative commentators who had long praised Vance's populist message found themselves scrambling to distance themselves from him. Liberal commentators declared it one of the most effective political takedowns they had ever witnessed. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from Ohio itself. Environmental groups that had fought Ohio Energy Partners for years suddenly had smoking gun evidence of the political corruption they had long suspected. Citizens who had voted for Vance based on his promises to fight corporate influence felt betrayed and angry. Within 24 hours, 3 separate investigations had been announced, one by the Ohio State Ethics Commission, another by the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and a third by the Senate Ethics Committee. Vance's political career, which had seemed destined for national prominence just hours earlier, was now in ruins. In the days following the CNN interview, investigative journalists and political opponents began digging deeper into the documents Jasmine had referenced. What they found painted an even more damaging picture of Vance's consulting work than had been revealed during the television appearance. The Ohio Energy Partners contract, which Jasmine had only summarized on air, contained provisions that were even more explicit than she had indicated. Vance hadn't just been paid to provide regulatory advice. He had been paid specifically to use his political relationships to influence government decisions in favor of his corporate clients. Email correspondence between Vance and Ohio Energy Partners executives, obtained through public records requests filed immediately after the CNN interview, showed a level of coordination between the consulting work and political advocacy that crossed clear ethical lines. In one particularly damaging email from March 2019, an Ohio Energy Partners executive wrote to Vance, "Your conversation with Rodriguez was exactly what we needed. The new interpretation of the compliance requirements will save us at least $40 million over the next 2 years. The board has approved your bonus payment." Vance's response was equally damaging. "Happy to help. Let me know if you need similar assistance with any other regulatory issues. My relationships with state officials remain strong, and I'm always available for special projects." The email chain showed that Vance wasn't just providing general consulting advice. He was being paid specifically for his ability to influence government officials to make decisions that benefited his corporate clients. Financial records, also obtained through public records requests, revealed that Ohio Energy Partners had paid Vance more than $3.2 million over 3 years, far more than Jasmine had initially disclosed. The payments were structured to avoid federal disclosure requirements and had been routed through multiple shell companies to obscure their origin. Most damaging of all were internal Ohio Energy Partners documents that explicitly described Vance as being on retainer to help the company navigate political and regulatory challenges. The documents included detailed assessments of Vance's relationships with specific state officials and his ability to influence their decisions. One internal memo from late 2018 described Vance as our most valuable political asset and recommended increasing his compensation because of his proven ability to deliver favorable regulatory outcomes. The political consequences for J.D. Vance were swift and severe. Within a week of the CNN interview, he had lost the support of key conservative donors who had been funding his potential presidential campaign. Major Republican figures who had once praised his political acumen began distancing themselves from him. Most significantly, the revelations about his consulting work completely undermined the populist message that had been the foundation of his political brand. Conservative voters who had supported him based on his promises to fight corporate influence felt betrayed by the evidence that he had been secretly working for those same corporate interests. Polling conducted in Ohio showed that Vance's approval ratings had collapsed, falling from 52% approval before the CNN interview to just 23% approval 2 weeks later. Even among Republican voters, his support had cratered, with many saying they felt deceived and betrayed by the revelations about his consulting work. The damage extended beyond Ohio. Vance had been building a national profile in preparation for a potential presidential campaign, but that effort was now dead in the water. No serious political operative would associate themselves with a candidate who had been so thoroughly discredited on national television. Perhaps most painfully for Vance, the revelations gave ammunition to all of his political enemies, not just Democrats, but Republicans who had been competing with him for influence within the conservative movement. Rival politicians began using Vance as an example of everything that was wrong with Washington corruption, often quoting his own words about fighting special interests back at him. For Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath of the CNN interview brought a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. She had spent 3 years carefully building the case against Vance, knowing that she would only get one chance to present her evidence in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The thoroughness of her preparation had paid off spectacularly. Not only had she exposed Vance's corruption on national television, but she had done so in a way that was so well documented and comprehensive that even his allies couldn't defend him. In interviews following the CNN appearance, Jasmine was characteristically modest about her role in Vance's downfall. "I didn't set out to destroy anyone's career," she told reporters. "I simply believed that the American people deserved to know the truth about Senator Vance's record before making judgments about his fitness for higher office." But she was also clear about the broader implications of what she had revealed. "This isn't just about one politician or one consulting contract," she said. "This is about a system that allows elected officials to profit from their public service while claiming to fight for the very people they're selling out. We need transparency, accountability, and consequences for this kind of corruption." The response to her performance was overwhelmingly positive, particularly among Democratic voters who had long suspected that many Republican politicians were not as populist as they claimed to be. Editorial boards across the country praised her methodical approach to exposing corruption and her ability to present complex evidence in a clear, compelling way. Legal experts noted that her presentation had been so thorough and well documented that it would likely serve as a model for future political accountability efforts. The way she had systematically built her case, using multiple forms of evidence to create an unassailable narrative, was studied in law schools and journalism programs as an example of how to effectively expose corruption. The multiple investigations launched in the wake of the CNN interview quickly validated everything Jasmine had revealed and uncovered additional evidence of corruption that hadn't been disclosed during the television appearance. The FBI's public corruption investigation, led by a team of federal prosecutors with experience in political corruption cases, found evidence of what they described as a systematic scheme to monetize political influence. The investigation revealed that Vance's consulting work had extended far beyond Ohio Energy Partners to include multiple corporate clients who had paid him for access to his political network. Federal investigators discovered that Vance had received more than $5 million in consulting fees over 4 years from companies that were simultaneously seeking favorable treatment from state and federal regulators. The payments had been carefully structured to avoid federal disclosure requirements, with money flowing through a complex network of shell companies and intermediaries. Perhaps most damaging was the discovery of what prosecutors called a favor bank, an informal system whereby Vance would use his political influence to help corporate clients with the understanding that they would reciprocate with financial support for his political activities. The Ohio State Ethics Commission's investigation focused specifically on Vance's interactions with state regulators and his use of political relationships to benefit his consulting clients. The commission found evidence of at least 12 separate instances where Vance had contacted state officials to advocate for positions that directly benefited his paying clients. The commission's final report concluded that Vance had violated multiple state ethics laws and recommended that he be referred for criminal prosecution. The report also recommended sweeping changes to state ethics rules to prevent similar conflicts of interest in the future. By the time all the investigations were complete, J.D. Vance's political career was effectively over. The evidence of corruption was so overwhelming and well documented that even his most loyal supporters could no longer defend him. In March of the following year, facing almost certain criminal prosecution, Vance announced that he would not seek re-election to the Senate and would be withdrawing from all political activities. In a brief statement, he claimed that he was stepping aside to focus on his family and to avoid further political persecution. The statement was classic Vance, deflecting responsibility, blaming others, and refusing to acknowledge the legitimate concerns about his conduct. But it was also irrelevant. His political career was over, and everyone knew it. The criminal case against Vance proceeded slowly through the federal courts, with prosecutors building a comprehensive case based on the evidence that Jasmine had first revealed on CNN. Eventually, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in federal prison, Vance agreed to a plea deal that included significant prison time and the forfeiture of millions of dollars in consulting fees. The plea agreement required Vance to cooperate with ongoing investigations into political corruption in Ohio, leading to additional prosecutions of state officials and corporate executives who had participated in the pay-to-play schemes that Vance had helped facilitate. For many observers, Vance's downfall served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of political corruption and the importance of aggressive oversight of elected officials. But for Jasmine, it was simply justice finally being served. The CNN studio where it all happened still hosts political interviews and debates, but visitors often ask about the night when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett systematically destroyed a rising political star with nothing but evidence and moral clarity. Tour guides tell them about the moment when J.D. Vance made the fatal mistake of dismissing Jasmine as an ideological activist, not knowing that she had spent 3 years preparing for exactly that kind of attack. They talk about the documents that revealed a pattern of corruption spanning years, and the audio recording that captured a politician explicitly discussing how to help corporate clients avoid regulatory compliance. But they always end their tours with a reminder: democracy depends not just on elections and institutions, but on individuals willing to do the hard work of holding those institutions accountable. The question Vance had posed, whether Jasmine had come for ideology while he had come for facts, had been answered definitively. But it had also raised a more important question. What happens when the facts reveal that the people we trust to serve the public interest are actually serving themselves? The answer, as 31 million Americans learned that night, is that sometimes it takes just one person with the courage to speak truth to power to bring down an entire network of corruption. The briefcase that Jasmine had carried into the CNN studio was empty now, its contents having served their purpose in exposing corruption and holding a powerful politician accountable. But its impact would be felt for years to come, as a reminder that in America, no one is above accountability, and truth will ultimately prevail over political calculation. J.D. Vance had calculated every word that night to humiliate Jasmine Crockett. Instead, he had provided her with the perfect opening to expose years of corruption and abuse of office. And in doing so, he had learned a lesson that every politician should remember. When you dismiss someone as an ideological activist, you better make sure they don't have the facts to destroy you. Because sometimes, the person you're trying to silence is the only one in the room willing to tell the truth. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts.